All right, then I think we will get started. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Eric Tars, Senior Policy Director at the National Homelessness Law Center. And I'm so thrilled to be here to be able to share with you more about our Human Right to Housing report card. We've been doing this report card from about 2012 to 2016, but we took a pause for a few years, but we are excited to be bringing it back given the renewed interest in looking at housing as a human right here in the United States. I'm also so grateful today to share the stage with an all-star cast of panelists who helped to make the report card what it is, and I hope will inspire you all to use the human rights framework to advocate for the right to adequate housing in your communities. So where are we headed today? We'll start with an overview of the report card and what the human right to housing itself is. Then we'll go through a couple of sections of the report card with our presenters sharing how they apply the human rights framework to the issues that they're working on, and then hear from one of the students at the University of Miami Law School Human Rights Clinic who helped us to produce the report card about how they're using the human rights framework in some of their local advocacy. We will leave time for some Q&A later, so please use the Q&A feature in your Zoom toolbar below or the chats, and click on the icon, type your questions in, and we'll try to answer them either in the chat boxes or actually orally at the end of the presentations. So, what is the human right to housing? It is a great slogan and a banner to stand behind, as our friends out in California pushing for 2 bills and an amendment to the state constitution to recognize housing as a human right know well. And it's a message that racial justice advocates have been pushing us towards for a long time, and probably longer than you might think. It's also a powerful rhetorical framing that our own elected officials have used from the time of the Great Depression up through the COVID recession to build the narrative basis to push the policies that we actually need to keep Americans adequately and safely housed. But it's also a statement of international law, one with actual content and meaning that we can use to hold our governments at the federal, state, and local levels accountable. And why is it important? Because when affordable, adequate housing is just a commodity or a bit of charity that government can offer or deny, we have to beg for it. But when we understand that housing is a human right, we can demand that our government meet its duty to us to uphold our rights. At the international level, the human right to housing is more than just 4 walls and a roof over your head. The right's been defined by General Comment 4 of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights to include 7 core elements, everything from affordability to accessibility to available of services in the community. This is part of the beauty of the right from an organizing perspective. It enables all of us, whether we're fighting to protect homeless persons from criminalization, tenants from eviction, home buyers from discrimination, communities from being left without hospitals or other critical infrastructure, all to put our issues together in one comprehensive framework that says we're all fighting for the same thing, the human right to adequate housing. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing, a top international human rights expert, has also set forth 16 guidelines on implementing the right to adequate housing that we use to inform our analysis in the report card. And so our report card takes those 7 elements and uses the 16 guidelines and applies all of them to US federal policies, grading the country on how it's been upholding the right since our last report card in 2016. And as I said, the right to adequate housing is incredibly broad, and we aren't experts in all of those different areas. So we reached out to our partners with lived expertise and policy expertise in all different aspects of the right. Law students from the University of Miami Law School's Human Rights Clinic interviewed and collected data from many of those partners, including some of the folks who are presenting on the call today. And even then, there's still so much more we don't know about how the right to housing is being violated all across the country and what policies are actually being put in place to remedy that. And we hope that today's presentation will both inspire you to reach out to us to get those issues included into our next report card, or as Juliana will talk about a little bit more later, put it into your own report card and think about how you can use this as a tool wherever you are. So do we have David on the line yet? David is here. Excellent.
Yes,
Hi, David.
yes, I'm here. Sorry, I just had a little problem getting in.
No worries.
But I'm here.
So we will jump right into it. We don't have enough time today to go through each of the sections in the report card, but we'll share a few, and in each, I'll share the international definition with you so you can see how great the standards are. And then each of our presenters will talk about the application to their issues. And first up, we have legal security of tenure as one of the core 7 elements of the right to adequate housing. And David Peary, the founder and executive director of the Miami Coalition to Advance Racial Equity, is going to talk about how that rights intersects with criminalization of homelessness. You might not think that homeless people would have any rights, but you can see in the international definition that every form of housing, from rentals to emergency housing and informal settlements, are included, and all persons should have protection against forced eviction, harassment, and other threats. And this last sentence down here is really great too, emphasizing the essential nature of genuine consultations with directly impacted communities in developing policies to implement the right. So, David, how's it going in Miami? Are all unhoused persons being genuinely consulted and enjoying their legal protections against forced eviction, harassment, and other threats?
Absolutely. And then I wake up and I realize what the reality actually is, because I've been asleep and dreaming that in an ideal world in which human rights, that dignity and respect, which is a birthright of every human being, is being recognized by the government. Unfortunately, right now, it's just an ephemeral dream, and it is not accorded to people who are of low income or who are of no income, as are the unsheltered homeless. So yeah, that's an unrealized dream, and that we're working very vigorously to secure the dignity and respect that's, as I said, is accorded to every human being, a birthright of every human being. So you want me to talk for a few minutes, and I apologize again for my showing up late. How many minutes?
You got about 5 minutes, and
Okay.
yeah, share what's going on there in Miami and how you've been talking about this issue as a human rights issue.
Sure. So we're struggling here in Miami against politicians using, unfortunately, the low income and no income poor as political footballs, essentially, and grandstanding, I guess, on crime issues. Get tough on crime and sanitary and safety issues as really a justification to criminalize poverty and to criminalize the homeless. And that's really unfortunate. I've been working in this area for several years now, and I've come to the conclusion that much of it is political opportunism. These laws that we have that essentially, as I said, get tough on crime and criminalize the homelessness and criminalize poverty, and a lot of it has to do with, unfortunately, our societal disdain, if you will, if not bigotry, against the poor and against the homeless. And that's really unfortunate. So we really need to work to change attitudes, to stop regarding the poor as second class citizens who have made quote unquote wrong choices that have relegated them to be poor. We need to recognize that there are powerful systemic forces that manufacture poverty and that breed homelessness. And we tend to overstate the role of personal responsibility and understate the role of these systemic forces, such as an unlivable minimum wage. Nowhere in the United States can you work 40 hours per week and afford a 1-bedroom apartment. So you can follow all the rules, work 40 hours a week, and you'll still be forced to sleep on the streets. Okay, and we have a predatory for-profit healthcare system that makes healthcare into a mere commodity. So if you can't afford it, if you don't have insurance, you just get sick and die. So that's what we see among the homeless, is many people with chronic diseases, COPD, cardiovascular, hypertension, diabetes. That's a huge one. And that's when you overlay a map of the incidence of diabetes, for instance, on the income levels of neighborhoods, you'll see a nearly 1-to-1 correlation, if you will. So these are social, what do you call it? Social determinants of health. So essentially, to circle back to this issue of the legal security of tenure, unfortunately, we have many laws that blame the victims of poverty, and blame their resulting circumstances on themselves, on the victims themselves, rather than looking at the systemic forces that really create poverty and force people onto the streets. To directly address the legal security of tenure, the most fundamental requirement or right, if you will, would be the right to adequate counsel, especially for the working poor. You have, I don't know what the statistics say, but probably a greater than 90% chance of losing an eviction case if you don't have counsel. Okay, the landlord, there's an unequal distribution of power. When you go into court and you're about to be evicted, landlord has incredible power. They have a lawyer. They're required to have a lawyer if they're a company. And you go into court without counsel, you're basically going to get evicted or forced into a bad settlement. So I think the most basic fundamental thing that you need to guarantee a legal security of tenure when it comes to being against being evicted is there needs to be a universal right to individual counsel for everybody who goes into landlord-tenant court. To extend that to folks who are actually out on the streets, we want to end homelessness, but we do not want to continue supporting these laws that criminalize the homeless and criminalize poverty. You're just digging the hole deeper, and we're not ending homelessness. Criminalization, if you will, is an expensive way to make homelessness worse. So we need legal protection for the unsheltered homeless to protect them from these laws that criminalize sleeping on the streets, which really compounds the cycle of homelessness. So I don't want to take up too much more time, but that's where I see the most effective and the most necessary avenues for legal security of tenure.
Awesome. Thanks, David. And you previewed our next presenter. Next up is Maria Rumian-Seva, the Associate Coordinator at the National Coalition for the Civil Right to Counsel. As her organization name makes clear, Maria is part of the movement to ensure, among other things, that renters have a right to a lawyer appointed for them when confronted with an eviction or foreclosure, the same as a criminal defendant has one when facing a jail sentence, because having the right to legal security of tenure isn't effective if you don't have the tools to enforce it. And this is an area where we've seen some good news over the past few years at the local level, but there's still a long way to go nationally. Right, Maria?
Yeah, there is. David, thank you you saw my head bobbing along. It almost fell off. I was nodding so hard. And in Miami, I mean, the stuff that's happening around the right to counsel, right, in your own kind of region and area, and trying to push that forward is just such a good transition into this piece. So first of all, it's fantastic that you guys are doing the report card again, and that we could all use it as a tool in all of our kind of collective advocacy around all of this. I have a couple of remarks around the right to counsel, give a little bit about what's happening nationally, and a little bit about what the write-up that John provided for the report card. It was, as of 2022, there's been some even kind of greater advancements since 2022. The first thing that I want to do is just to get everyone on the same page. I do want to pop in. We have a pretty good matrix of all of the jurisdictions that have passed a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. So I want to pop that into the chat, not to take away from the report card, but to add to the report card, right? So that we have all of these resources where we're using them. But that gives you an overview and all of the parameters of the right to counsel programs that exist right now. The right to counsel discussion is housed within the report card. It's housed within the legal security of tenure and then fits within kind of the broader discussion of renter protections under the rights against forced eviction, right? So like it's housed within that conversation in the report card. And that's a really appropriate fit for it because the right to counsel is it's not a silver bullet. It's not the end all be all. It's in the news a lot. And it's like a big thing that we're all talking about right now, but it is just one of the tools that are named throughout this report card and tools that we advocate to really be done with homelessness and housing instability and to really pursue housing as a human right in the US. So the legal security of tenure got a C- in the report, and the right to counsel, the discussion, that's part of the reason that it got that rank, because the status quo around the country right now still, although 22 jurisdictions, so 4 states, Westchester County in New York, 17 cities, although all of these places are enacting the right to counsel for tenants facing eviction, majority of places, the majority of the US, no right to counsel on the books, no law that guarantees a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. And so generally, you're gonna go into jurisdiction around the country and you'll see tenants going it alone most of the time. And so when the NCCRC took a look at some of the eviction reports around the country, nationwide and on average, where you don't have a right to counsel in place, you have about 3% of tenants represented in eviction proceedings, compared to about 81 to 83% of landlords that are going into eviction cases, that are pursuing eviction.
Hey, there.
Oh.
Can I join my webinar? I'm on this panel. They go.
David, we can hear
you. So that's the kind of status quo right now, but it is rapidly changing. And the reason that it is changing, like the thing that I want to highlight, and it's done in the report card, but what I really want to, it kind of emphasizes the conversation that David was having with us before, but the rise in tenant activism, tenant organizing, the refocusing on tenant power and tenant demands, rental demands, for really truly safe, truly deeply affordable housing around the United States, and that increased kind of fire of the tenants' rights movement and housing justice movement, it's really moved the right to counsel for tenants facing eviction forward. So now we do have 22 jurisdictions, like I said before, since the report card was published, 2 additional cities. So Jersey City, what is the other city? It is popping out of my head, but I'll remember it and put it in the chat. 2 additional cities and then 1 county, Westchester County, added a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. The right to counsel, like I said before, it's one of the tools that's named throughout the report card to help kind of mitigate the effects of eviction, both those immediate effects, so like job loss, poor school performance for children who are evicted or who are facing eviction, physical and mental health issues for tenants, those immediate effects of eviction, and then the spillover effects that kind of happen and can happen for years down the line. So like the staining of your credit report and your rental kind of record so that you're prohibited or inhibited from renting in the future. And the right to counsel is a mitigator of that. And the report card highlights a couple of the studies that have shown legal representation, so not right to counsel specifically, but increased legal representation for tenants, how that benefits tenants. And we see pretty consistently and across the board that you increase legal representation in there, and the outcomes of increasing legal representation include, increased housing stability for those represented tenants. We have lower arrears judgments that are happening in eviction cases because Lawyers are advocating, using the tools in their legal tool belt to help advocate on behalf of tenants and lower those arrears. And really getting more time for tenants to vacate if they have to, and to vacate with a bit more dignity. I'm not going to say full dignity, because who is, that's a really traumatic and in crisis moment, no matter what. But getting a little bit more time for tenants to find a new unit, secure the money to secure a new unit. There are a lot of pop outs, or two major pop outs in the report card around the right to counsel that highlight the economic benefits that we've seen from cost benefit analyses. But this is really true for housing policies in general, right? When we don't invest in good housing policy, we pay a hell of a lot more, period. We pay a lot more. And it is true that when you look at the cost benefit analyses of right to counsel, if you invest Detroit, for example, $16.7 million in a right to counsel on an annual basis, you're going to, the estimated economic benefits to the city were estimated to be around 58 million. That's incredible to kind of, even just the estimated economic benefits, that's incredible. And so those kinds of points are highlighted throughout the report. And then the recommendations that, of course, are ended on are, the federal government making sure that they're fully funding legal aid programs to ensure universal access of counsel for tenants facing eviction. And then there's state and local recommendations about ensuring a right to counsel. But in addition, the last point, and then I'll kind of close and hand it off. In addition to those recommendations, what I want to say is that there are also recommendations at the state and local level within the report card about other rental protections that really interact so well with a right to counsel, right? A right to counsel helps enforce the renter protections that we all need, just cause protections, more notice when an eviction is coming down the pike, if evictions are a thing that we're going to continue doing, more notice, so increased notice provisions. And then the interplay with the right to counsel is that the right to counsel helps enforce those renter protections. And then also with those renter protections, we get to like a decrease on the burden of the right to counsel program, because not as many evictions are filed if we're really focusing on those protections. I couldn't possibly touch on everything that's included in the report card. I'm going to hand it back to you, Eric. And yeah.
No, thank you. That was fantastic. And yes, and that's exactly the point of the report card is, again, to help bring all of those things into this collective framework and show that it's, we need both the right to counsel and just cause eviction and other renters' rights protections in order to be able to fully enjoy the full right to adequate housing. But with that, we'll keep on moving on. Next up, we have Michael Santos, Associate Director of U.S. Poverty Policy at Results and Chair of the ABA Commission on Homelessness and Poverty, to talk with us about housing affordability. Here in the U.S., housing is usually assumed to be affordable if you're paying 30% of your income or less on your rent or mortgage. But at the international level, it's a relative standard that explicitly intersects with your other human rights. Housing is affordable if the cost doesn't interfere with you meeting your other basic needs. So if an elder is choosing between paying for necessary medication and rent, that's a violation both of the right to health and of the right to housing. Or when we see families cutting back on nutritious food to pay the rent, that's a violation both of the right to food and the right to housing. Also note that unlike in the US, where we leave everything up to the market, it's on the state to ensure that housing is generally affordable. That could be through direct subsidies or other forms of market regulation. But when we see places like California, where more than half the state renters are burdened with unaffordable rents, that's not on the private market to fix. That's a violation that the state is required to remedy. So, Michael, if you can tell us a little bit more about the scope of the problem here in the US, as well as some of the exciting new policy approaches that could bring the U.S. more in alignment with this idea that affordable housing is part of every American's basic human rights, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. And thank you so much for having me here today. For those of you who have not had a chance to meet yet, again, my name is Michael Santos. I work at Results. It's a grassroots national lobbying organization working with lawmakers in Congress, in Capitol Hill, to create the political will to actually end poverty. And as Eric said, I also chair the ABA Commission on Homelessness and Poverty. So I work with the legal community on how to address the legal problems of people who experience homelessness and or poverty. And I think this is a nice way of following up after David and Maria, because I was also a former eviction defense lawyer based in San Francisco, California, which was one of the early right to counsel jurisdictions in the country. So I'd like to speak to you today about housing affordability. So again, as Eric said, one of the sections in the Human Right to Housing Report Card talks about housing affordability and gave the US government a failing grade. And there are several reasons for that, and why this is the case. But let's first talk about this term affordability. And as Eric had mentioned, when I talk about affordability, it's the simplest way to define it is that housing costs or rent should be reasonable and attainable, such that paying for it does not compromise or threaten one's ability to secure other necessities like food or healthcare. So no one should be choosing between one basic necessity to another basic necessity. And sadly, this is not the case in the United States. Millions of households are rent burdened, and key to realizing adequate housing is ensuring affordability, right? So all of these things are interconnected. But as I said before, affordability is out of reach for so many, especially now that we're faced with inflation, high inflation, wages that have not kept up with inflation. So the math is just not there. And there are different ways, different solutions to address the affordable housing crisis. We can talk about it later on during the Q&A portion of today's webinar. But I'm looking at a different solution, one that involves the tax code. And why that is the case will become clear in the next few minutes, right? In early August of this year, the American Bar Association actually passed a resolution in support of laws that provide financial support to renters, such as refundable tax credit for lower income renters, the restoration of the advanced child tax credit, the expansion of the earned income tax credit, and the low income housing tax credits. Now, if any of these things sound foreign to you, do not fret. There's actually a report that I encourage you to read. And the accompanying report also talks about the Human Right to Housing framework. So I think this nicely touches and builds upon the current publication that we're here to talk about today. Let me put this in the chat before I forget. So why the tax code? Well, tax systems have been an important tool to provide relief for struggling individuals and their families, including renters and households across the United States, right? Critical investments during COVID-19 pandemic, and that includes the temporary expansions to the CTC and EITC, really enabled the United States to prevent, at least temporarily, a wave of evictions and improve food security, housing security, mental health, and overall family needs of millions of households, including 40% of households with impoverished children and their families. So what exactly is a renter tax credit? Now, Results, my organization that I work for, has a primer, a background document on what a renter tax credit is. I'm happy to talk about it offline, or I'll be available after this webinar session for Q&A as well. And you can also watch a short video that is posted on our website, and I'll put the links in the chat shortly. But the key takeaway here is that it functions just like other forms of tax credits like the CTC or EITC. The main difference is that this credit, unlike the CTC targeting families with children or EITC targeting low-income employees, the RTC or renter tax credit targets rent-burdened households. And it's designed, or can be designed, so that households are not paying more than 30% of their income towards rent, right? And at least half of the states have some form of tax credits or even deductions in their state tax codes, right? This is in the books. But what states have are not enough. All still needs to be scaled to match the demand and the need for affordable housing. Several states have categorical eligibility requirements, limiting the reach of the renter tax credits and housing assistance to just people with disabilities, seniors, and those with limited or fixed incomes. Other states, the amounts set are just not enough. to make a dent on housing affordability. And I like to use California as an example, where if you make under $60,000, you're eligible for a whopping $50 in renter tax credit for the entire year. So this is one of the states where housing is extremely expensive and out of reach for so many low-income households. So why do we need a renter tax credit? And why particularly the tax code? Why are we talking about these things in the context of the human right to housing framework? Well, the tax code currently does not prioritize renters, and renters do not receive similar benefits to homeowners, landlords, or developers. So we see a big imbalance, power imbalance, really, when you're looking at the tax code and how it treats poor people, right? There are tax benefits for developers, for builders, for landlords, for business owners, for homeowners, for the wealthy, for the corporations, but none go directly to renters, right? There's this distrust that we impute to people living in poverty, and the distrust that they won't be able to use the money, the funds that they're given in the right way that we actually envision them to use the money for. And this lack of a prioritization in the tax code is really a broader symptom of how the tax code treats people living in poverty or those who are rent burdened, and this harmful trend of commodifying housing instead of treating it as a basic right. Right. And similar tax credits have proven effective in lifting people out of poverty. Right. In 2021, we had the advanced child tax credit, which allowed families with children to get their tax credit on a monthly basis. And the size of the credit for each eligible child also increased, providing families some type of economic security on top of what they received in terms of earned income or stimulus payments. Yet, right, instead of building on these solutions, our government allowed these solutions to lapse and pull households back into poverty. And this is one of the reasons why we gave the US government an F, right? Efforts and challenges to those efforts to actually expand tax credits, to provide better treatment, tax treatment of poor people in the tax code. Really is indicative of the long road ahead, the amount of work to get us to a place where there is a human right to housing. Another reason why the tax code is that existing programs are inaccessible and or unavailable to many households, right? You probably heard of the statistic that only 1 in 4 eligible households can access housing choice vouchers. And unfortunately, state and local actions to address the affordable housing crisis are not enough, right? There's actually a big case for a federal intervention and why it is very much needed. The private housing market is also unreliable. There's just a lot of housing discrimination and other distortions in the housing market that is purely after revenues. So we need other new housing solutions in addition to housing vouchers, and we need the openness and the commitment and the political will to these new solutions. Lastly, I'm just going to say the federal tax system is really an efficient lever to address the affordable housing crisis, and can help set the pathway towards a human right to housing. So this is why I see the work of achieving economic justice in the tax code as a form of housing justice and as an extension, really, of racial justice. We all know that housing insecurity, that poverty, housing injustices disproportionately impact and affect marginalized communities, BIPOC communities. And we've seen the role that the tax code can play in addressing and mitigating and or even ending poverty, homelessness, and rent burden in housing insecurity if done the right way. So I'll leave it at that. I look forward to the Q&A, and I'm going to turn it back to Eric and to the next speaker, Katie Meyer-Scott, to talk about accessibility.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. And yeah, just to put a really fine point on it, what you were saying about the 1 in 4 people who get housing subsidies, rental subsidies today, a rights-based approach would make sure that that's 4 out of 4 people, the people who need the subsidies actually get them. And the shift that the renter's tax credit could make there is that as with the mortgage interest income tax deduction, as with the child tax credit, these were subsidies that go to everybody who applies for them. There's no limitation. There's no annual appropriations process where Congress gets to decide we're actually only going to only going to put 1/4 of what's actually needed into the budget. These go as a matter of right, as an entitlement. And so that's why the renter's tax credit, I think, is the biggest step on affordability towards a rights-based approach, because it gets it out of that annual appropriations process. Happy to talk more about that later, but now we are on to the accessibility element of the right to housing. And again, accessibility at the international level is more expansive than just the simple rental or mortgage discrimination against persons with limited protected categories that it's often boiled down to in the US. At the international level, all disadvantaged groups must be afforded full and sustainable access to adequate housing, with laws and policies taking into account their special needs. And while we could talk about so many different aspects of that, right? I'm happy to have Katie Myers-Scott, the director of the Law Center's youth program here, to talk about one particular vulnerable group, unhoused youth, who often face barriers when trying to access housing, and the fact that government bureaucracy sometimes creates those barriers. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to potentially get some of those barriers removed. So, Katie.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that introduction, Eric. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk about youth, especially when we're talking about a human rights framework. Young people are often overlooked and are often have less rights than adults do. And so I really love talking about youth in a rights-based way. So I actually am going to start where I was going to end, because Michael's presentation just really put such a fine point on this. I'm going to go very specific and then broaden it out a little bit. So in the report card, the one part that's kind of specifically about youth references direct cash transfers. And the reason that that is in there is because direct cash transfers, which is essentially you get a certain amount of cash, no strings attached. You don't have to do anything for it. Most of the programs, there is some parameters as far as like age or income levels, but as far as like having to check in with a case manager or do certain things for the cash that particular month, that is not really what a direct cash transfer is about. It's just a guaranteed, you're going to get $1,000 this month, each month for like the next year. And that is something that's been really put forward as a homelessness intervention for particularly young adults who are often left out of other government benefits, can't even get the earned income tax credit, although they could, during some of the pandemic rules. But that's something, there's no like special, cash assistance programs for that age group. So essentially with direct cash transfers, youth would be able to know that they're going to have something that could potentially help them meet their rent for that month. It's preferred over vouchers because it's so much more flexible. Like you can have a roommate and still use your direct cash transfer. You can be in school and still use your direct cash transfer to pay towards your rent, or you may have some other rental subsidy. And so then you can use your direct cash transfer for other things like your food and your health and your education and the other important things that we should all have rights to. So that is something that a lot of states, well, I shouldn't say a lot. There's 5 states that right now have a initial sort of appropriations towards the direct cash transfer programs. There's a lot of jurisdictions that are experimenting with this as well. So individual cities in the United States that are looking at these kinds of programs. But as we know, like through the child tax credit, I mean, the federal government has the power to just put money directly into your bank account. You don't have to do anything. That money can just show up there. So if we were to have a truly sustainable, effective direct cash transfer program, I think the federal government is the place where that could truly happen. Of course, the child tax credit is a tax credit that operates a little bit differently, but essentially we'd be asking the government to do the same. But in the report card, one sort of sticking point that has happened for a lot of youth and young adult advocates is that they're receiving HUD funding through Runaway and Homeless Youth Act programs, youth homelessness demonstration projects, and there's nothing in the regulations that seems to prevent agencies from using those HUD funds for direct cash transfers, yet they've been told that they can't use them for direct cash transfers. And so essentially we are advocating for HUD to sort of go with the letter of the regulation and not sort of an interpretation that would say no direct cash transfers, and allow those agencies receiving that grant funding to use it for that purpose. I do just want to zoom out a little bit more, though, and talk about this year we went through a process of revamping our state index on youth homelessness to essentially be centered around the human right to housing framework. We went from having like a handful of metrics tracking housing laws to having half of the index track housing laws. And, you know, one of the things that we heard over and over with youth is youth are coming to us with like various intersectional identities, and disabled youth are overrepresented, you know, in the homelessness population as, you know, compared to the general population. And so one thing that we heard was just the issue of having accessible housing, like being offered a housing option that they could not take because it was not accessible to them. Being offered a housing option that they could not maintain because of various disabilities and issues. And then even just being a young person, you're in your first apartment, dealing with a landlord, dealing with bills. These are things where young people need support to get through that and to be able to maintain that housing, whether it be some of just that support through like a right to counsel in being able to maintain that housing and avoid eviction, or whether it be, you know, behavioral health, mental health, and other kinds of supports while they're there. So those are other things that we're looking at in the state index that I think connects as well to this accessibility piece. And I look forward to talking more about this issue.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. And we will wrap it up with our presentations on the different elements with cultural adequacy. We know that the US has a long history of deliberately using housing and land policy as part of its genocidal campaign to eradicate the culture of Native Americans and the people themselves. Some of this was explicit, such as the expulsions of people from their historical lands, but sometimes less so, such as HUD Native housing policies creating housing inconsistent with extended Native family structures. Restrictions on guests and other forms of subsidized housing can also impinge on other forms of family cultures. And policies which encourage gentrification can change the cultural heritage of entire neighborhoods. Caroline Laporte is the director of the STARS Indigenous Safe Housing Center at the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, and also serves as an attorney and judicial advisor to the Tribal Court of the Seminole Tribe of Florida, and as an associate judge for the Little River Band of the Ottawa Indians. Caroline, what should we be looking at in current federal policy towards Native American populations?
Yeah, I think there is, first of all, thank you so much for that introduction, and you really summed up a lot, but usually I feel like I have to go through a whole history lesson, so that was good. It was great, actually. So really quickly, one of the things I want to talk about is, or at least start with from my own thinking, right, is what does it mean for housing to actually be culturally adequate, right? And how, right, like, and certainly talking about the way that housing is constructed and the things that we see in the report are very valid, especially with kind of the history of HUD and how it evolved, and the role that they play. And it's a very important role in Indian country for public housing. But what does it mean for housing to be culturally adequate for tribes? And very specifically, what does it mean for housing to be culturally adequate, as Eric stated, within a nation that really sought to eradicate its indigenous people from their own land, right? What can that actually look like? And there's kind of a tension point there that I think we have to just set aside, because it's genocide, and it's difficult, and it's not going to get solved via just like mainstream housing policy. The report, I think, does a really great job focusing, for example, on funding for Indian tribes. Most of you know there's 576 federally recognized tribes in the United States. They're all sovereign nations within nations. And I think that's critical. I want to talk about that funding in a minute. But really, culturally adequate housing looks like tribes and their citizens having access to their land. And why is that, right? Because as Indigenous people, we tend to heal and feel supported when we have access to things like our traditional medicines, our teachings, right, which are very much connected to land and significance of place, our language, political involvement, right? What does it mean to be a citizen of a nation that you don't live within the jurisdictional boundaries of, right? A lot of Native people actually live in urban spaces. That's hard. What does it mean when you've sort of been forced into that position? How does that resemble removal, et cetera? We need access to our elders, to our families, supports really that we need in order to thrive. These are all things that assimilation stripped from us very intentionally. The report does call out assimilation, so I do kind of want to take a minute to talk about that too. I think that's really important, and certainly from a federal policy space is something that we often don't shy away from being really vocal about. But if you consider the sort of arch of the United States history in regard to safe housing and shelter for Native people, you're going to see things like massive land theft from our populations, forced removal of Indigenous people from our homelands. We've got Supreme Court opinions that really, I don't know, like not just memorialize, but almost fetishize the doctrine of discovery, right, and manifest destiny. We've got the Indian Civilization Act, Homestead Act, Dawes Act, Hawaiian Homes Commission Act. I mean, there's a zillion things I could go on and on about. Specifically, Indian Relocation Act, though, I think is something to call out in this space. We've also got a lot of failed consultation. We've got encroachments on our lands via oil pipelines. I mean, sort of the ways in which all of the bad things like come to the center in Indian country is really something that's impacting individuals that we all as Native people really care about. There are things that are impacting people in my court. There are things that impact family members, et cetera. So those things are really important to just kind of hold, like, and it's not going to get solved in this conversation. So it's just something we hold like in abeyance, right? Culturally adequate housing is also going to look like tribes implementing peer-to-peer culturally based programming and public housing. So where we do have federal policies that focus on things like self-determination, right? Those are working really well. That's going to look like people being able to speak their language in these spaces, having access to those medicines, and then services that are culturally rooted and specific, and really importantly, that aren't pan-Indigenous. I think there's like a weird sort of impetus to like teepee canoe things when we're in spaces where we don't do, right? Like we're not necessarily actually working from a culturally specific place. And not all Indian people are the same people, right? We have our own. If you just think about the breadth of 576 nations within a nation, all with their own cultural significance, language, et cetera, all with our own ideas about what it means to keep each other safe, you know, the pan-Indigenous approach is really problematic. Another thing is that tribes obviously need access to funding. Indian country doesn't have a tax base. You know, despite it being one of those sort of like, you know, like really important pieces of a sovereign, tribes can't tax. So for the 75% of the individuals who are non-Native that live in Indian country is not pulling funds from them while still having to provide some supports and services, right? So the report does an excellent job talking about things like NAHASDA, which is really the key piece of federal legislation that provides funding in Indian country for public housing. NAHASDA has been flat funded since 1996. Got a bump this past year of about 20%. It's not enough, right, to meet the disparate need in Indian country. So it's an important call out. NAHASDA also has consultation requirements within it, which are really great from a federal policy space. Another thing that I think people don't, you know, at least in my work, right, is that I primarily work with survivors of gender-based violence. And we have a complete and total lack of domestic violence shelters in Indian country. And, you know, the sort of the mainstream space that I work within has largely moved away from safe shelter, emergency shelter, into more permanent supportive options, et cetera. And those options are great. We support all of those things being available. But when you don't have a triage space to address crisis, it's really hard for survivors to just go from the immediate thing that they're dealing with, right, directly into housing first or DV housing first or even permanent supportive housing. It's also really difficult for somebody who has been on the street to go into permanent housing, at least not without some support. So without having, you know, like, for example, there's not a whole lot of dollars to build shelter in Indian country. So I think that's important. The other thing I'll just say really, really quickly, because I'm running out of time, is that tribes as sovereigns implement on their own land, their own laws that not just recognize housing and safe shelter as basic human rights, but that are Indigenous responsibilities and duties. That I have an obligation to people in my community. That's very much in line with the human rights framing. But again, this is something that tribes are doing. So if the feds are not meeting that federal trust responsibility, which is both legal and fiduciary, then they are in fact failing Indian country in regards to housing. So I think this is something the report does a good job of calling out, and certainly something I would be interested in talking about in the Q&A, but I will wrap up for there because I think I'm out of time. Thanks.
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, and we are running short on time. The Q&A I think is going to be a little bit limited, but definitely this is supposed to be the beginning of the conversation and not the end. So, but last but not least, in terms of our presentations, we'll have Juliana Green, a student from the University of Miami Law School Human Rights Clinic. Prior students from the clinic, under the supervision of their professor, Tamar Azer, helped to prepare this year's report card. And now Juliana is going to tell us a little bit about how they're using this report card as a basis to assess the realization of the right to housing for Black residents of Miami-Dade County, which again, we hope is going to provide some inspiration for how this might work in your own areas.
Thank you so much, Eric, for the introduction. Hi, everybody. My name is Juliana Green, and I'm a legal intern with the Human Rights Clinic at the University of Miami School of Law. Thank you so much to each of the panelists for all your insights on these pressing issues. Our clinic is really proud to have collaborated with this panel today. And we are also really proud to work alongside NHLC, MCARE, and NIWRC on numerous current advocacy projects that we are working on. And our clinic will be using this report card as a basis for our future advocacy. So this National Right to Housing Report Card has underscored the racial disparities across the 7 dimensions of the right to housing in the US that we've talked about today. And our clinic is building on the report card and using it as a starting point for an assessment of the realization of the right to housing for Black residents, specifically in Miami-Dade County. And the project is also in coordination with the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. This is a global platform that focuses on addressing the human rights situation and issues faced by people of African descent here, but also all over the world. So this provides a forum for discussion, advocacy, and the exchange of ideas to promote the rights and well-being of people of African descent. So the Permanent Forum is interested in collecting data from across cities in the US, and we'll be using the data to submit our assessment to them. We are also currently engaged in research on the 7 dimensions of the right to adequate housing in Miami-Dade County specifically as well. We know that obviously Miami-Dade County is home to a wide range of immigrant groups, and they've been facing extreme displacement due to the lack of affordable housing, gentrification, and numerous institutional and systemic inequalities that have existed for, centuries. And we'll be integrating this data on these specific groups into our advocacy and current projects. So as part of our assessment, we will be hosting a town hall in the spring as well. We're aiming for March, and we're doing that to gather community input. So we'll be collaborating with a wide range of advocates and those directly impacted by these issues. And we are looking for their insights and to collaborate with them and use that for our future advocacy. Additionally, our clinic works with David of MCARE. We're working on right now 2 complaints to the UN Special Rapporteur. The first complaint we're working on is on adequate housing. So this will address the recently passed Miami Beach ordinance, which authorizes police to arrest people for sleeping or lying in public if they don't move or refuse shelter. However, the irony of it all is that there's no shelters in Miami Beach. So these people are basically being forced to move out of their home cities, even though there's no shelters even available in their area. The second complaint is on the right to food, and this will address a City of Miami ordinance already in place from last year and the year before, criminalizing food sharing or the feeding of people experiencing homelessness in groups of 25 or more without a permit and at non-designated feeding locations, but there's only 5 locations designated and they're in inconvenient areas. So again, the irony of it all. And both of these complaints will be completed next month. We're really excited to work on those, and we're in using the research and all the data from the housing report card for all of our future advocacy in general as well. And we're just really looking forward to continue collaborating with these amazing panelists and advocates. So thank you so much for all your time, and to Eric for having me. And I think next up will be the Q&A.
Yep. So I'll just quickly wrap up by saying that the standards that we're talking about today, these 7 elements, are decades old. But I want to emphasize something that Juliana was mentioning there, that these standards are also being made every day. Just last week, working with David in the clinic and others, we got the UN Human Rights Committee to issue these new recommendations to the US to abolish the criminalization of homelessness here. And we can use these recommendations in our policy advocacy and in litigation. And in fact, in the past, some of these recommendations have resulted in HUD acknowledging criminalizing homelessness violates our human rights obligations, and turning that recognition into important grant incentives that advocates are using in their communities to help stop criminalization of homelessness. And the DOJ submitting a brief in our 8th Amendment case, affirming our position that criminalizing basic life-sustaining conduct violates the Constitution, which the DOJ itself acknowledged as implicating our human rights obligations as well. And now we are seeing elected official after elected official talking about housing as a human right. We have moved the conversation about housing as a human right from the margins of our political dialogue to the heart of it. And some officials are even introducing legislation now actively identifying housing as a human right at the federal level. And at the state level, we are working with broad coalitions of advocates to pass a constitutional amendment in California that would make housing an enforceable human right for all. But we haven't gotten there yet. And until we do, we will continue to monitor and evaluate the progress the government is making on the enjoyment of human rights of homeless and unstably housed persons. And where it exists, we will give them credit and we'll promote those successes. And where not, we will hold them accountable using these standards we talked about today, both through the international processes and through our domestic advocacy, such as this Right to Housing report card. There's lots more resources on our website and at housing.handcuffs.org. Follow us on social media and please be in touch if you need anything further. We are running right up on time. So I don't know if any of the panelists has anything further that any of them wanted to say, either responding to the questions that have come in through the chat. But yeah, if anybody has any closing remarks, quickly. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, if I can quickly emphasize us leveraging these connections that we made with United Nations officials, global human rights officials, and drill down from that 30,000-foot level to the street level to emphasize the human rights aspect of the criminalization of homelessness and the criminalization of poverty. And we can put cities on trial on a global stage. I think that may be a very important tool in our advocacy toolkit.
Excellent. Katie,
I was also just going to say to the question in the chat about Seattle, yes, as a Seattleite, I do think they should be held to a higher commitment if they've confirmed their commitment to this. So really open to more ways of how we could do that, because I don't think this most recent election has really held Seattle to their housing commitments. So would love to chat more about that, Amanda.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up and say, you know, the treaty that this is all drawn on is one that the U.S. has signed but has not ratified. It is not technically legally binding in the U.S. That doesn't matter. These rights and these standards are what we as advocates make them. If we hold our government accountable to them, then then they become the standards in effect. But if we don't use these standards, then the government's certainly not going to hold itself accountable. So if you know that your city, like the city of Seattle, has passed one of these kind of non-binding resolutions saying we're a human rights city, and they are doing nothing to actually behave as a human rights city, yes, absolutely use that stick it into an op-ed and say, Seattle claims it's a human rights abiding city. Here's this report card. Here's, we know that the standards around the right to housing include X, Y, and Z. We are not, abiding by that. We are not acting like a human rights city. I think that's a great tool for accountability that you can use for sure. Anybody else have any last minute comments?
Well, I guess I could respond to Cynthia's follow-up question in the chat there, whether or not, since no tax mechanism exists, tribes have to really utilize grant funding in order to implement programs that are relevant to their citizens. She asked if there were enough dollars for all 576, and do they have the capacity to apply? I think the answer to both of those questions is no. Unfortunately, I think the reason it's remained low is that they've relied on the fact that not all 576 tribes are even aware of the funding, and therefore don't apply for it. But also, it costs money to write a grant, right? It costs money to implement a program. A lot of dollars in Indian country are formula funded or formula based, and so you've also got to have the population to back it up. So if you're a tribe of 3,500 people, you might only get a $55,000 grant to run a shelter. That's not enough money to even staff a shelter. So those are just things that we think about in the space that I work in. That's a really great question. Thanks, Cynthia.
Awesome. Well, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to everybody who's attending. This is an ongoing conversation, and yeah, like I said, these rights are what we as advocates make them. So use the report card. If you have questions, please be in touch, and let's go out there and make housing a human right. Thank you.